Hey, this is Bill Marion, and you're watching A Nose for Life.
So Carolyn and I visited the Biltmore in Asheville, North Carolina, and we had a great time. While we were there, we captured video and images and created a YouTube video about the Biltmore because that's what we do. Nice. I highly recommend you watching that video after this video because the Biltmore is one of those places you have to visit. If you've been to the Biltmore, I know you'll enjoy that video, and if you haven't been to the Biltmore, you'll want to watch that video to understand why it's one of those places you have to visit at least once, and trust me, you'll want to stay there at least 2 or 3 nights. It's at the Biltmore I got the idea to make this video because of my own curiosity. So I'm going to begin by discussing what I found just touring the Biltmore and then what I learned about gargoyles after. I hope you'll find this as interesting as I do and kind of creepy and, well, maybe even a little scary. But I want to provide you a little bit of history first about the Biltmore before we get into gargoyles, and there'll be a reason why at the end of the video. It'll kind of make a full circle. You know what I mean. After all, there are quite a few gargoyles around the Biltmore. I mean a lot, a whole lot of gargoyles around the Biltmore. In 1889, George Vanderbilt, son of William Henry Vanderbilt, commissioned construction on the Biltmore after hiring Richard Morris Hunt to design this American castle. The architecture and construction of the Biltmore is the primary reason I visit. What always comes to mind is that George Vanderbilt seems to have believed when you want to do something, you do it right. For example, George chose the land for the Biltmore because of a visit to the Blue Ridge Mountains with his mother. On that trip, he simply fell in love with the mountains of North Carolina, and that was it. He had to build a castle because he needed a castle, and so did America. So George Vanderbilt and architect Richard Morris Hunt built the first and really only American castle. The Biltmore was built with the French Renaissance in mind, and the French Renaissance was one of the results of the wars fought between France and northern Italy during the 16th century. Wars, for a variety of reasons, produce a kind of cultural exchange between the two fighting countries. For example, northern Italy provided a great cultural deposit into the Kingdom of France in the 16th century, and a part of this deposit is the art and architecture of the Renaissance. Simply stated, wars between the two countries produce the cultural seeds that bloom into the French Renaissance. Like any historic time period, the beginning and end of the French Renaissance is subjective. Generally speaking, it lasted about 100 years, beginning in the late 15th century and ending in the early 17th century. Regardless, this is the style Vanderbilt and Hunt had in mind for the Biltmore. Châteauesque is an architectural style birthed from the French Renaissance. You don't see this a lot in America, but you're usually close to a national landmark when you do see this style in America. Châteauesque is rather easy to identify. You want to look for steep roofs, shaped a lot like pyramids, often breaking off to flat roofs, multiple dormers, a stone finish, and usually some towers. You'll also see ornamental metal, arched windows and doors, and often a Gothic influence. Bingo, Gothic. When I hear Gothic, I think of dark, stormy nights, vampires, castles, and evanescence. So wake me up inside and get your darkest eyeliner ready. We're going goth. But why Gothic? Well, Gothic might be the most memorable architectural form coming from medieval Europe. Sure, when I think of Gothic, I think of dark and dreary, but the truth is that the architects of that time period weren't thinking about darkness at all. They were thinking about light. Keep in mind there's no electricity, so the only source of light comes from the outside. So when you're building, you're always thinking about ways to maximize the light coming from the sun and using that light as a form of expression. So it turns out the Dark Ages weren't so dark, as innovation led to churches, kings, princes, and landlords to construct huge buildings with light in mind. Keep in mind there's a lot more to this, and I'll provide links in the description. But you know, nothing happens in a vacuum. While medieval architecture shares similarities, each building is quite different than the other. And never forget that if you lived in the Dark Ages, you really wouldn't see Gothic buildings as Gothic. You would simply see them as places you gather for worship or court, and if you were fortunate, a place to call home. So here's where we're at so far when it comes to gargoyles. During the French Renaissance, gargoyles resurface as the Châteauesque style flourishes in France and in memorable places around the world. But when this style resurfaces, it is certainly retro because gargoyles are definitely medieval, going all the way back to the 13th century in Europe. And there are some things we have to get straight about gargoyles. First, many of the images in these videos I'm showing here are not gargoyles. Sorry about that. In order to be a gargoyle, there has to be water coming out of its mouth. If there's no water, they're called a grotesque. And it may be that a grotesque is far more interesting than a gargoyle. In both cases, gargoyles are usually carved from stone and represent human or animal faces. They are always ugly, always scary, and look like twisted versions of humanity. I was always under the impression that gargoyles served as a way to scare people into submission. That was definitely not their primary purpose. Gargoyles functioned as a decorative drainage system to expel moving water from a rooftop and away from the walls of the building to prevent erosion. And this method works well, and it's been in use long before the Dark Ages. But modern gutters are far more efficient. People who lived in the Middle Ages knew the real purpose of gargoyles. Maybe some people believe that gargoyles really guarded the inhabitants from evil spirits, and sure, they may have been used by ministers as a way to provide an example for something else. But I can't find any evidence that people actually believed in their existence during the medieval time period, and there's no biblical reference to gargoyles, and they sure don't look like angels. So many people believe today that no one in the Middle Ages actually believed that gargoyles were something other than a decorative way to expel water from a rooftop. And here's something really cool about gargoyles. There are no two alike. And by the way, using this method to remove water from the foundation of a building or structure goes back a lot farther than the 13th century. And mixing art with your method of draining water, well, it goes back at least to the ancient Egyptians. One of the links in the description is called Crystal Links. And of all the websites I combed through, I found this one to have the best pictures and simplistic explanations. And it was the first site that I found in which some people in the church going back as far as the 12th century were not happy about the use of gargoyles. I can't say I believe everything at Crystal Links, but their information about gargoyles was pretty interesting, and it's a pretty good website. There are many people who believe that the church used gargoyles to depict hell, and some preachers may have done that very thing. But it wasn't an official edict or anything like that. Most sources agree that the stonemasons had complete artistic control over the gargoyles, so it's not like the church was designing gargoyles on their own. Individual masons actually created gargoyles and gave them their artistic beauty or hideous nature or whatever you want to call it. But remember, gargoyles' half-brother, well, is a grotesque, and a grotesque did serve primarily as a decorative piece representing something spiritual, and it had no practical purpose. These ugly carved pieces of rock were created with the purpose of symbolically protecting the church. And that's kind of weird on several different levels. Now, if you stuck around to this part of the video, I just want to say thank you for watching, and I hope you'll hit that like button and join our growing community by subscribing and clicking on the bell for notifications. And if you're on VidMe, just hitting that follow button. By sticking around, you're going to hear the other history of gargoyles, and this is where it gets weird and even more interesting. We were saying earlier in this video that the Châteauesque style was all the rage during the French Renaissance, and the French Renaissance came about in part because of the wars between the Kingdom of France and northern Italy during the 16th century, and that created cultural exchanges between the two kingdoms. But it's odd that gargoyles make a comeback during this time period for a few reasons. I mean, one would think that gargoyles wouldn't be adopted into architecture during any aspect of the Renaissance, and honestly, I have some guesswork as to why, but it would require a lot more study, and maybe I'll save that for another video, but probably not. The main reason I wanted to make this video is not to discuss the origins of gargoyles, but to discuss their incredible comeback during the resurgence of the Châteauesque style of the 19th century. This is the part that I find the most interesting. Remember, I was at the Biltmore when I got the idea to make this video. The Biltmore was built in the 1890s, but gargoyles were being used a lot during this time period, and I mean a lot. Bernard of Clairvaux was one of the first to speak out against a grotesque and gargoyles in the 1100s or 12th century. Bernard was a pretty big deal in his day, and he was asked to use the pulpit and his influence to persuade the church into a new crusade, often referred to as the Second Crusade, which ended miserably for the Crusaders, and blame was placed at Bernard's feet, because that's what you do when you lose a crusade. If you look up his wiki page, his opinion concerning gargoyles and the like is very clear. He challenges the church to consider the purpose of creating creatures that don't exist. The quote, which I'll provide in the description if I have enough room, suggests that gargoyles were everywhere, and building gargoyles wasn't a new thing. Bernard recognized that the church was increasingly tolerant towards pagan symbolism, and Bernard wasn't so happy about that. And it seems to be true that during the early medieval period that many of the gargoyles may have been created with legends, myths, and fables of their paganistic history in mind. And like I said earlier in this video, the church wasn't actually designing these gargoyles, rather it was the stonemasons' creativity at work. St. Bernard saw this as a pagan infiltration of the church, and Bernard obviously wasn't a huge fan of gargoyles. Nevertheless, if I had to stop right here and vote on gargoyles, that is to say, if I had to make a decision as to whether or not they really represent good, evil, or some kind of in-between, and I have to add that theologically there's no such thing, I'd have to say, maybe, maybe not. And they're on Ghostbusters and Batman. I mean, because the name of the city in Batman is Gotham, so yeah, there's gonna be gargoyles. When it comes to Batman, by the way, be it in the comics, cartoons, or the big screen, the imagery is always the same. Batman, like a gargoyle, is fighting for good, but from a place of darkness. But saying there's no real historic evidence that gargoyles have a standing tradition in good or evil is boring. Very boring. And I need clickbait material to help grow this channel. Okay, so here's the best spin I can put on gargoyles, and this might even be why you're watching. And you might even wish I would have skipped the whole first half and jumped straight into the following dark conspiracy that I can't substantiate. But it might be true. I did run into some websites that talk about legends of gargoyles and how they have been seen allegedly flying around old churches or old libraries, even in the southern state of Alabama. Probably because the food is good in Alabama, but the summers are long and punishing, so that's why gargoyles only come out at night, because they don't like the heat. Or maybe not. Now remember, we started out at the Biltmore, which was constructed at the end of the 19th century. And it turns out that each time architects borrow from the French Renaissance, the use of gargoyles seemed to increase. So you get your pyramid-like roofs, arched windows, towers, and dormers, and you get some additional gargoyles. In fact, the grotesque at Notre Dame Cathedral were not in place until the 19th century. So what's up with that? Here's what is true, unless something is uncovered that would tell us otherwise. During the 19th century, there is a resurgence in the occult. This is likely to be the reason we see architecture reflecting the symbolism of the Middle Ages, because if you're going to have a Châteauesque architectural revival, and that movement originates in the Middle Ages, then you're going to have more gargoyles because you're into that sort of thing. And just like now, if the rich neighbor next door has a dozen monsters on his roof, then you want 24 on yours. Why the occult movement exploded isn't really debatable, but it's described differently by different historians as they're always trying to reword something that someone else has written. The American church, and again using that term in the broadest manner, begins to divide gradually. More than half of the church during that time period becomes tolerant and curious about the occult and even other religions. Interest in the occult, magic, secret societies, and even sexual curiosity increases nearly 100-fold into the 19th century. Why? Well, we think it has something to do with the increase of the working and also educated middle class. They had more time on their hands for some extra reading and to attend secret meetings. It was the only form of respectful entertainment available that they had, and by respectful I just simply mean that during the Victorian age they could keep their craziness a secret. It may have a little to do with science and progress. It was important during the 19th century to more and more people because just like today, a new invention was rolling out every few weeks. So some people were looking for scientific explanations and cures for disease by understanding the occult and mystic religions. Some really sick ideas come from this time period as well, like eugenics, racial purity, imperialism, and these are just a few examples of 19th century nonsense. And it's here that we land at the Biltmore and engage with the historical record about the Vanderbilts. And let's try to determine if there's any kind of mystic quality to George Vanderbilt and his apparent love for gargoyles. At least one would think he loved gargoyles, considering how many gargoyles there are around the Biltmore. The Vanderbilts amassed a huge fortune from steamboats and trains thanks to Cornelius Vanderbilt and his son William Vanderbilt, who doubled the family fortune. So here are the facts. While Cornelius Vanderbilt, also known as the Commodore, was making his fortune, he attended many tarot card readings throughout his life, and this increased in his later days as he relied on two fortune-telling prostitute sisters, the Chafflin sisters, to give him investment advice. The Chafflin sisters also claimed to be able to make ectoplasm materialize, and no, I'm not kidding, because you can't make this stuff up, like ectoplasm. I don't know what trick they used to pull it off, but they did. But what's funny is that their financial advice actually worked for the Commodore, not because of any spiritual or mystic gifting, but because the two sisters indirectly had inside information about Vanderbilt's competitors due to their business dealings. Anyway, at one point, one of the Commodore's competitors told Cornelius' son William that Cornelius had lost his sense of moral right and wrong. I'm paraphrasing that slightly. In other words, you better put your dad out to pasture, he's gone and lost his mind. Anyway, when the will was read, of course after Cornelius died, the Commodore's family sued, stating that Cornelius was not mentally stable because he left most of his fortune to William, which turns out to have been a pretty good idea since William doubled the family fortune. William actually had to pay the two fortune-telling sisters to leave the country so they wouldn't be available to be subpoenaed. William's inheritance, which was equal to that of most if not all of the money in the U.S. Treasury at the time, was handed over to him, and of course he proceeded to make more money. That's not a conspiracy theory, that's history. But it's hard to find concrete information about George Vanderbilt, the grandson of Cornelius or Commodore Vanderbilt, being associated with the occult, or his father for that matter. Maybe the family has made the information disappear. Maybe, but it's not likely, and there's a lot of good reasons as to why. For starters, the Vanderbilt name doesn't really end with George Vanderbilt. There are other powerful people in the Vanderbilt family who may not care one way or the other about covering anything up about the Vanderbilt past, and one of those reasons might be that there's nothing to cover up. Not to mention that not everyone in the Vanderbilt family was thrilled about the amazing Biltmore Estates or Gargoyles or any of the like. That kind of intrigue is fun, but not really for this video. There's a lot of interesting stuff about the Vanderbilt family, but again, it's not for this video. But outside the fact that George's grandfather was a fortune-telling, loving, prostitute-seeking, horse-gambling kind of guy, I can't find any additional evidence that would suggest that George Vanderbilt loves gargoyles for any other reason than art. And considering all of the other artwork one can find at the Biltmore, that kind of makes sense. And yet, for some reason, it's still kind of weird. And that's how history is supposed to work. I might still suspect something, even a whole lot of something. But of the dozens of websites that claimed otherwise, I couldn't find any actual evidence that what they were writing was true, even if it made sense. And of those websites, many argue that the Vanderbilts were part of the Illuminati bloodline and blah, 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 blah. You know the usual.
So that's all I could come up with when it comes to gargoyles. I'm sure there's a lot more information out there about gargoyles and, of course, the Vanderbilt family. And I would love to hear what you have to think, and you can provide your opinion or your research there in the comments. In fact, I love it when you comment. I love it when you say, hey, you misspelled something, or you need to change what you said about this because it's wrong, or whatever the case is. I love that. So put any kind of comment you want to in the comments below. Be sure you click that subscribe and like button. And again, thank you for watching. I'm Bill Marion, and this is A Nose for Life.